Ukrainian and US delegations are meeting in Saudi Arabia for talks on ending the war in Ukraine. The Ukrainian side is expected to put forward plans for a partial ceasefire with Russia. Ahead of the talks, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio said he's optimistic, provided Ukraine is prepared to, quote, do difficult things. It is the first time the two sides have met since Washington cut off military support to Kyiv. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is also in Saudi Arabia, but he will not participate in this week's negotiations. Let's bring in David Salvo. He's a managing director for the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund. That's an American public policy think tank. David, what kind of agreement do you expect at the end of these round of Ukraine-US talks?
Well, I think at best there will be some sort of agreement on a partial ceasefire. The question is whether Russia is interested in a partial ceasefire. I'm skeptical of that. And I think all the pressure that's being put on Ukraine to make further concessions, it's sort of a strange tactic since nobody seems to be asking Russia what concessions they're willing to make, and they've only put forward maximalist demands. So I'm a little bit skeptical that this meeting in Saudi Arabia is going to lead to much beyond, say, some sort of Ukrainian agreement on a partial ceasefire, but even that remains unclear whether it can actually be implemented.
Now, there are reports that the Ukrainian delegation will propose a ceasefire in the air at sea. Do you think that's a meaningful first step towards an agreement?
I mean, I think it shows Ukrainian goodwill, but what more goodwill do they need to demonstrate? You have an invading country that's bombarding it to smithereens, and I think Russia has every intention to continue to bomb Ukraine, to try to get it to submit to Russian domination and an agreement to end this war solely on Russian terms. So I think what I would like to see coming out of Saudi Arabia is maybe a little bit of flexibility in the American position to show that it is willing to go to Moscow and ask the same difficult questions of the Kremlin that it's asking of President Zelensky.
Now, since that disastrous meeting between Zelensky and Trump at the White House, there has been a lot of anti-Zelensky rhetoric in the US administration. Do you think, from that perspective, that he is still the right man for Ukraine to lead these negotiations? Or would there be other leaders with whom the Americans would rather cooperate?
I mean, I'm sure that there are other Ukrainian leaders that the powers that be here in Washington would like to work with more than President Zelensky. But President Zelensky's fate for the Ukrainian people to decide, not for the White House or for anybody else here in the United States or for Russia, for that matter. So I think as long as President Zelensky is the democratically elected president of Ukraine, he's the man that we have to work with and we should work with.
Now, Ukraine's European allies are currently excluded from the talks. How do you see the role of the Europeans in this process towards a ceasefire?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I'll never understand why Europe doesn't have a seat at this negotiating table. Here we are in the United States asking Europe to shoulder the burden of defending Ukraine, and we're not even allowing it a seat at the table. It's quite astonishing, honestly. But I think Europe will welcome a ceasefire, obviously, but the devil's in the details. Will Russia actually uphold the implementation of a ceasefire? Again, I'm skeptical of that, but if Ukraine comes out, if there's an announcement today that Ukraine's willing to move forward on a partial ceasefire, that's very constructive. I'm sure European leaders will welcome that. And then the onus is on Moscow to agree to that as well.
Now, just this morning, Ukraine has launched a massive drone attack on Moscow. The Russian military has also ramped up its attacks on Ukraine. Do you think that the fighting will continue to increase in intensity, especially in the period before a possible ceasefire?
I do, and it's one of the reasons why I'm sort of inherently skeptical that a ceasefire can hold anyway, because I think it's in Russia's interest to continue to fight, to continue to consolidate gains, to continue to take as much territory as it can in the coming months, knowing that Ukraine's hand is weaker than it has been, knowing that the United States has stopped sharing intelligence with Ukraine, knowing that American military aid is very possibly gone forever. So I don't see it. I don't see how Russia would actually agree to some sort of long-term stable ceasefire agreement, given that it believes it controls all the cards right now.
All right, we want to go now to our correspondent, Max Zander. He joins us live from the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. Max, Zelensky noticeably absent from these talks. The world certainly has taken notice of that. So what are you hearing about these talks from where you are?
Right, so these talks are not making a lot of noise, at least from where we are here right now, from what we're hearing, and perhaps that's a good thing if you compare it to how the Ukrainians and the Americans got together the last time in the White House. But what we're hearing is that there were at least 2 rounds of talks today. The day started with a 3 to 4 hour discussion in Saudi Arabia in the morning, followed by a short break, and a second session that was underway shortly after. From what we're hearing, there hasn't been a lot leaked content-wise, what was on the table for discussion, but there have been some unconfirmed reports that the first phase of the talks, or the first session, focused on President Zelensky's proposed partial ceasefire deal, the mineral deal that is again on the table now, and the second session was supposed to focus on security guarantees. But to what extent these topics were discussed, we're not hearing a lot about that, and that's likely also part of the idea of this deal to keep this things under wrap, to take it to the Russians later this week.
And Max, do we know what would Ukraine consider a successful outcome of these talks in Saudi Arabia?
I mean, first of all, for the Ukrainians, it would be interesting to understand what exactly the American position is right now, because they have changed noticeably from supporting Ukraine, from backing them up, from sending military aid, to taking all of that away. So what does America now want from Ukraine? What concessions do they want them to make? And perhaps what is the plan, if there is one? Marco Rubio, ahead of these talks, said there was no outline that they would present to the Ukrainians, but perhaps the Ukrainians would get a better understanding, better idea of what is going on. And then in addition to that, President Zelensky suggested a partial ceasefire deal, meaning no more attacks in the air and in the sea, meaning no more Russian or Ukrainian missile or drone attacks, no more attacks in the Black Sea. And in addition to that, he proposed other measures, such as exchange of POWs, as well as bringing back some of the 20,000 plus abducted Ukrainian children who have been taken to Russia and occupied territory.
Max, we heard U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying that Washington expects Ukraine to make concessions to reach a peace deal. No word on expectations that Russia will make concessions. How is all of this being perceived in Kyiv?
Right, it's not being perceived very well, I would say. There is great sense of the Ukrainians being let hang, being abandoned in a way, and some would go as far as to say the Americans are now blackmailing the Ukrainians into submission, into doing exactly what the Americans want, to get a deal at no matter what. So this whole situation is perceived quite negatively here. But President Zelensky made clear over the last couple of days, after the situation in the White House, that the Ukrainians were determined to talk to the Americans, and they know this is the only way forward, because they will need the Americans to sustain and to get an agreement.
Our correspondent Max Zander in Kyiv reporting for us tonight. Max, thank you. And our coverage continues now with Joshua Shifrinson. He's an associate professor at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. Professor, it's good to have you with us. There are reports that the Ukrainian delegation will propose a ceasefire in the air and at sea. Do you think this would be a meaningful first step towards an agreement?
Well, certainly anything that ends the immediacy, the intensity of the violence, and the war on the ground has certainly become a stalemate. But in the air and at sea, it's certainly been a more fluid environment. So offering a ceasefire in those arenas at a time when Ukraine just launched the largest Ukrainian drone attack of the war against Russia would certainly be a meaningful step back. And if that held, it could very well be a pathway towards some more enduring, more meaningful ceasefire, akin to something that we saw, say, in Korea in 1953.
Since the disastrous meeting between Zelensky and Trump at the White House a couple of weeks ago, I mean, there's been a lot of anti-Zelensky rhetoric within the U.S. administration. Do you think that Zelensky is still the right man to lead Ukraine, or are there other leaders with whom the Americans, with whom President Trump would prefer to cooperate with?
Well, it's certainly true there are other Ukrainian leaders who Mr. Trump would love to do business with. However, Mr. Zelensky, by all accounts, is the most popular politician in Ukraine. He's led Ukraine throughout this conflict. And in a sense, one needs someone with Mr. Zelensky's nationalist credentials to sell any peace deal, any ceasefire to the Ukrainian public. In other words, anyone Mr. Trump would rather do business with may not be the person to deliver on an agreement to the Ukrainian people. So if we hope for a more enduring settlement, we need someone like Zelensky in office, if not Zelensky himself.
And you are certainly aware that Ukraine's European allies have been so far excluded from these talks. How do you see the role of the Europeans in this process towards a ceasefire?
Well, in reality, the concern with Russian aggression, future Russian aggression against Ukraine, is not going to go away. Even if there's a ceasefire, or there's going to be lingering hostility, lingering concerns, all justifiable. So the fact that the European allies of Ukraine, the European allies of the United States, have been broadly excluded from these talks is going to mean that the ball is going to be in Europe's court. European support for Ukraine going forward, bolstering Ukraine's defense capabilities, offering some kind of security guarantees, as the United States makes very clear that it is not as invested in European security as it has been in times past. All of this is going to up the European interest in helping Ukraine, all the European incentive to help Ukraine in the future. And it's actually going to increase the opportunity for Europe to play a constructive role in European security.
You know, we've seen in the last 24 hours Ukraine's biggest attack so far in this war inside of Russia. The timing of this is certainly noteworthy. How do you think it's going to impact these talks?
Well, there are two different ways of looking at the drone strike, and I think both could be true. The first way to look at it is that this is Ukraine reminding Moscow and the United States that it has meaningful capabilities, that although it may be under duress on the battlefield, it is not at all at a point of abject surrender. So this is a signal that Ukraine has to be taken seriously. At the same time, it could also be a case to try to scuttle, or at least create tension within any ceasefire deal, by reminding the United States, above all, that Ukraine has to be party to any ceasefire. And these two things could go together. So I think very plausibly this drone strike is a signal that Ukraine has to be supportive of whatever deal emerges, meaning the U.S. can't simply go over Ukraine's head to Moscow if the U.S. wants a deal that sticks.
Okay, Professor Joshua Shifrinson, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.